Greetings, psychology students. I am Professor Zeeb, and today we're going to talk about something called the empty nest syndrome or the empty nest. No, we're not talking biology. We're not talking birds and bees. We're talking about a nest, an actual real life issue that people deal with when it comes to their children leaving home. And in this case, their last child has flown the coop, so to speak, also known as the empty nest syndrome. So let's take a look at our slides here. All right, and it turns out that this has been changing in terms of what it classically was. All right, so let's talk about the empty nest syndrome once again, referring to when our last child actually officially flies out of the nest or leaves home. All right, so the empty nest syndrome are the feelings that parents have after their last child has left the home. All right. This can be a positive experience and or a negative experience. A lot of parents, at some point your kids are going to leave the house, and as a parent, I know it's something I'm going to have to deal with, and where I'm potentially going to feel sad about that. So a lot of parents report that they have this sort of negative feeling when this first occurs, when their last child has left home, at least during initial phases where we see the negative feelings a lot. But then we've also found that it is associated with positive feelings as well. So for example, a lot of parents report that they have more privacy than ever before, which I thought was interesting. This could be sort of a second honeymoon. So now that the kids have left the house, they have time to do other things and adult sort of activities, if you would. In other words, it may be sort of a second honeymoon period where your marriage is revitalized, that kind of thing. This is a time when parents often evaluate the job they have done as a parent. So once again, this could be a positive experience or negative. If your child has left the home, they're very successful and they have a lot of good things going on, you feel so proud as a parent. It shows that you did your job. All that hard work that you put in for the past several years have finally paid off, and they are a successful adult living in society. However, things don't always turn out as you want them to. So let's say your child is a complete failure, or maybe they're in prison, or maybe you just didn't do a good job as a parent. That can also bring back negative feelings because you feel almost like you're a failure as a parent because you didn't raise your child right or teach them the correct things or whatever it is. So it kind of depends obviously on the scenario and the situation, but it can be filled with positive and or negative feelings. We're also finding that in general, the period after the departure of children when they're leaving is actually getting longer than ever before. And that's because humans are living longer. So obviously, the period from when your last child left to when you actually die and so forth is actually longer because people are living longer than ever before. However, that being said, we have found that a lot of adult children are moving back into the nest. They are coming back home, so to speak. And so we're finding that this can change. We're going to talk about that. So we call that the refilling of the nest. So this is where the adult children have moved back in. So they've gone off, they've come back. A lot of this has to do with some of the uncertainties of the economic climate in which we live in. Obviously there's adult issues involved here that could cause something like this, and we're going to talk about those. So once again, this is what we're referring to here is when adult children are moving back in to live with their parents. Maybe this is after a divorce. So the child moved out, they were married, the marriage didn't go so well, so they can't support themselves, so they move back home. Or maybe that's where they go for comfort and that kind of thing. Maybe they're seeking emotional support from their parent. And so they've come back home to refill the nest, so to speak. So obviously there's several things that could have happened. In this situation, we would expect the parents to continue to provide additional support to the adult children. So that could include things like loans, maybe loaning them money, providing educational gifts of some sort, providing emotional support, maybe helping them find a job because maybe they've moved back home because their career has failed. And so they're providing support in that sense. So in other words, even though the parents have kind of done their job and they've sent them on their way, they've come back and now the parenting is not quite over. You still have to take over that role and deal with your adult children is kind of what that's saying. apparently, according if we look at the research, is that this refilling can create tension and problems on both ends, by the way, not only with the parents having to deal with it, but the kids, the adult kids as well. And we're going to look at both of those. So we're going to look at some common complaints of adult children who are living with their parents, some common things that they often say about living at home with their parents as an adult. Number one, their parents are trying to restrict their independence. So even though they're adults, they still will not let go. You know, they're treating me like a child basically and not letting me live my own life. So my independence is being sort of constrained in some way. Cramping my sex life. You know, I can understand that. You're trying to have a sex life while you're living at your parents' house. How difficult could that be and how weird and awkward at times? So a lot of adult children report that it cramps their sex lives. Another common complaint, I can't listen to loud music. I love that one. You know, the parents are complaining that my music is loud. They did it when I was a teenager. They're doing it again. They can't handle my lifestyle. Lastly, being treated as if they are still a child. So even though I'm technically an adult, my parents believe that I'm under their household. I have to follow the rules. It's almost like I've become a kid again and I have to follow those guidelines to live here. So they often complain that I'm being treated as if I'm a child, even though technically I am still an adult. All right. Now we're going to look at the parent complaints. Let's look at both sides because obviously there's going to be some tension here, or could be. So these are some common parental complaints about adult children living at home. Number one, the house is too noisy. You know, we talked about that before. I love that one. Worry about children coming home late. Oh, wow. So they probably did this when they were a teenager or something, and then they've come back home and then they're still doing it. They're still worrying about their adult child, you know, living their life and staying out late and sort of worrying what's going to happen to them. I mean, I can understand as a parent that would be hard to let go. Another common complaint, meals are hard to plan due to conflicting schedules. So in other words, the parents often get kind of upset that I can't plan my meals. You know, obviously a lot of people like routine in terms of their meals. And so it's hard when you have someone living with you that has maybe more of a erratic lifestyle compared to you, and that could create some tension. Parents are also saying that they have less privacy. My privacy has been invaded. I can understand that because once they've left the home, it's kind of relief. Wow, I can live my life. You know, I'm finally free of my parental duties. And now you're having to kind of give up some of that privacy, even though they're your own child. It could still be kind of difficult. So your privacy is feeling invaded on. Taking on too much responsibility for their adult children. So even though they are technically adults, right, they may have to sort of pick up the slack, whether it's watching the grandkids, supporting them financially, you know, helping them pay their bills, that kind of thing. In other words, they're doing too much. They're taking on responsibility that the adult child, because they're an adult, should be doing themselves. And yet they're the parent, they're still willing to do it, which is, you know, I can understand that would create tension. So either way you look at it, it turns out that there's complaints on both sides. I mean, obviously it can be a great thing depending on the relationship and the scenario. And it's great that adult kids can look to their parents for support. I mean, I think that's important no matter how old you are. But once again, there are some pitfalls involved on both sides as we've discovered. All right. So this will sort of conclude our short lecture here on the empty nest syndrome. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We will see you online.